Righteous Mamas is a podcast that is on a mission to transform our country. We tell the stories that matter, celebrate the hope, power, and hope of pissed off mamas who are building a better future for all of our children. Hi, I'm Martha Pincoff.
I'm Muna Husseini.
And I'm Cristina Sansun Ramirez.
And we are Three Righteous Mamas. Also, quickly, please subscribe and let us know what you think about Three Righteous Mamas by giving us a review. Give us all those little hearts and tell your friends about us. We're so happy that you spend this time with us. It means a lot to us. And today, let's talk about today. Today, we are going to be talking to a brilliant human, Saul Griffith, about how to tackle the most critical issue of our time, climate change. And when we do, how it will make all of our lives better. So very much on brand with delivering the world for our children. But first, this is, we're into season 2 and we haven't let the people know how we met, y'all.
I know, they need to know.
Can we talk about it? Y'all's meeting story is one of my favorites. Yeah, so it would really delight me if you would regale us with that story.
I guess I'll start and then Muna can add in because Muna's on mute and she's... So I had just given birth. This was like the 2 weeks after the election or something. And I was asked to MC a incredible event that was no ban, no wall. So it was really bringing in Austin of the Muslim, there were signs that said like of the Muslim and Mexican community together, which is really beautiful. So I was asked to MC it. And I had just given birth, and Muna was my co-MC.
And I'd like to say that I met Christina, but I think I met her mammary glands before I met her. Because as Christina mentioned, we were both asked to join this event and MC it together. Christina representing sort of the voice of Latino community, and I was representing the voice of the Muslim community. And so this whole entire event has been put together, and then we're asked to MC. And like I went to Christina's house to meet her and work through the program, and she was nursing Santi, and I was like, "Oh, hello, all of you."
Like, I was only women at the table. I was like,
and it's fine. I nursed. Absolutely. I just, I nursed both of my kids till they were 3. It's fine. It just, when you meet someone for the first time, like, it was cool. Like, I met, like, there was nothing else left to learn about. So,
I kept having to be like, Muna, up here. And I was like, no, the other eyes, Muna.
It was a learning experience. That's all I got to say. And so we got together, we figured out transitions, we emceed this event, and what was it, like 7,000, 10,000 people showed up?
10,000, 15,000 people. It was huge.
It was huge.
Moving. And then we became friends after that because, I'd never had a child. And it was like just a really raw emotionally time. If everyone can remember how you felt right after the 2016 election. And I think it was a raw emotional time for everyone. And then like as a new mom, I had all these hormones and feelings, and Muna was really there for me. Like she did the sweetest, nicest things for me. And just like was a great mom role model and support. So like, thank you for that, Muna. And yeah, I do always say like, Trump wanted our world to get smaller, but it just got bigger. And you two are such a result of that. So I think you two actually, when I proposed doing this podcast, like it was funny because we all were friends and connected, but not collectively. So how did you two meet?
So we met early on in Beto's campaign for Senate at like one of the very first fundraisers at a house out in Round Rock, and Muna stood up and asked a question, and I was like, I'm going to be friends with her. And we talked after that, and then I think we were friends on Facebook, and now here we are.
Martha was like, I'm going to be friends with her. We're going to have a podcast in 4 years, and
it's 4 years.
She could see it all.
I mean, it's the story of Martha and my meeting. Yes, we met in real life, but I think our friendship really blossomed over Facebook and social media. And that is true for so many of the friendships I formed after the campaign, or sorry, after the election in 2017 and Trump becoming president. Like, my world became so much bigger and I made so many friends. And Christina, you're one of them. And, it's really sweet for you to say what you said about me helping you. But I remember being pregnant while the presidential campaign was going on and all of the hateful rhetoric that was being spewed. I remember I would go for runs or walks later when I was pregnant and hopping into yards when cars were driving by because I felt scared and I was pregnant. And, I remember meeting you and your baby was so little. And at that time, my son was 1. And I knew what it was like to have a baby and be scared and be fighting. And I just was like, I can't be letting this mama go through anything alone. And we are the same community. And I think that's really the spirit of what we're trying to do here, is like bring all our people together, and there are no lines between our people. And that's what I love. Like, when I talk to people about Three Righteous Mamas, they are a little shocked. They're like, wait, Latina mom, a queer mom, and a Muslim mom. And I'm like, yeah. And what? We're all our people, and our kids are our kids, and we're building the world for all of our kids. So I love that we do this. But before we go on, Christina and Martha, y'all have to share how y'all met.
So we met in the spring time or summertime, sometime around there of
something like that.
Because I had started Jolt, and
that's right.
I would do events and like all kinds of events. And I remember I met these 2 women, Jill Noakes and Ana Salas Porras, that were these amazing women. And they said, oh, we wanted to meet with you. And they brought Martha to the meeting. So this really great woman that's an entrepreneur that really cares about getting involved and making a political change. Oh yeah, and she started some like vegetarian vegan burger company. Before I was like, yeah, entrepreneur lady. Oh, I was like, wait, she makes really cool veggie burgers. So I was like, looked her all up and was like, oh, she looks so cool. I can't wait to meet her. And then we ended up working together. And Martha came onto the board of Jolt. And then when I thought to do this podcast, I made a list of like moms actually to do this podcast. And I was like, who vibes well? Like, and I didn't know you 2 knew each other. I was like, who do I think could vibe well together and tell a different perspective and story? And that also has like the humility, the righteous mama strength part, but again, the humility and heart to lead in this work, in this conversation in a way that will really highlight what 3 righteous mamas could do. And I was like, Martha and Muna. And it all just came together. So that's my perspective of meeting you, Martha, if you want to add anything.
No, it felt very much like a match was being made, and it was a very good match. And like I've served on boards before, but getting to witness you and you building the Jolt organization early on was really unbelievable, because I haven't seen often like ever really that like the vision that you have for the world and your ability to bring the people together to then create it. So I guess it's what you do, what you've done with us on this podcast too. But I've been a huge fan of yours since the moment we met. And you're one of the rare people where the closer you get, the better it is.
Ooh,
you know,
wow.
Some people, like, you get real close and it's like, oh shit, I want to back off a little bit. But you're not one of those people.
With my laugh here. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Well, I will say, I think this really demonstrates the energy you put out is the energy you attract. Isn't that like what was it? The secret from like 2000 whatever. But jokes aside, what you appreciates. And that's why I love doing this work with y'all on this podcast, because we're highlighting the work that people are doing to build the world for our kids. And that's really what we're about is, it's okay to have feelings and it's okay to be upset, but then you roll up your sleeves and you get the work done, which is what mamas do, right? And so really excited to be talking to Saul Griffith today about tackling this issue of climate change. And let's jump in with Saul, y'all. We've got Saul Griffith joining us today. He's an engineer and inventor. He's the founder and chief scientist at Otherlab, an independent R&D lab, and he helps government agencies and Fortune 500 companies understand energy infrastructure and deep decarbonization. He's been a principal investigator and project lead on federally funded research projects for agencies like NASA and Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is also DARPA. He has started numerous technology companies acquired by the likes of Google and Autodesk, and Saul has also been awarded the MacArthur Genius Award. He is the founder of Rewiring America, which we will spend a lot of time talking about today. And Saul, I'd like to ask you, tell us a little bit about the handbook that you have out.
I wrote a handbook last year with a little bit of help from a few friends. The goal was to really provide a easily understood guide to how collectively we will decarbonize America. We've made that available for free at rewiringamerica.org. If you want, you can make a donation at the same time, which would be great. And then that book I'm just finishing today the last copy edits for it to be released with MIT Press in the summer of this year.
That's
so
awesome.
If you want to wait, you can wait and then buy it from MIT Press.
Yeah, well, and any donations will go towards building the largest gathering of folks who are interested in dealing with climate change. So thank you for joining us today, Saul. And for y'all to be able to follow him after this, you can check out at Rewiring America on Twitter going forward. So we're excited to chat with you today about how to tackle the most critical issue of our time, which is climate change, and how we can, when we do that, we will make our lives better. But I want to start by asking you the question we ask all of our guests when they join our podcast. We'd love to hear about a maternal figure in your life, someone who helped you to engage the world. Said maternal figure.
She's in the background, y'all.
I feel like we need some amazing narrator here. But yeah, tell us about the impact that she had on your approach to this amazing and necessary work you're doing.
Well, as you asked me about my mother, she was standing in the background. I have the pleasure of taking this call from a national park just outside of Sydney. And it's very apropos. I'm here with my mother. It's the first time she's been with all of her grandchildren in 15 years. So she's feeling full mother hen.
Silver linings of the pandemic, huh?
Silver linings of the pandemic. The only reason we are in Australia is because of the pandemic. So this is her silver lining. If you had to describe my mother, she's half David Attenborough, half Mary Poppins. And who's the lady in The Sound of Music? She's a doppelganger for that actress.
Julie Andrews.
Okay, so I think this is going to get the best mom description of all time. Go on.
Well, she is the best mom of all time. She's an artist, and my childhood, in all honesty, was completely magical. We would travel all over Australia to try and find the most beautiful locations or interesting creatures and photograph them and help her make her art. And so it was like a David Attenborough style guided tour of the flora and fauna of Australia. I grew up in the national parks, and even the most obscure, difficult to get to places. And the Mary Poppins part is, she just made it magical the whole way. And I think in a very, very direct sense, that upbringing gave me my fierce desire to, keep the beautiful things we have in this world beautiful and not to lose all the critters and the creatures and the trees as we fight climate change.
And actually, tell us where you are right now.
I'm at a place called Currawong, which is it's an old labor union cottage where the labor unions said that we should be allowed to have beautiful retreats just like the rich people in Australia, and they secured a couple of very decrepit huts in the middle of a national park in the Pittwater just north of Sydney, and they've now turned those into a place where anyone can stay, and we were lucky enough to actually we booked it for Christmas and New Year, but the pandemic happened in Sydney, so we didn't get that, and that's why I'm here this week.
Wow. So I actually have a little confession. I grew up in, we'll call them cities, or we'll call them compounds, away from nature, basically. And I didn't have an appreciation for nature until I moved to Colorado. Like, I think the most nature I'd come in contact with the grass in my yard or the trees that were planted, what I call like manicured greenery. And until I moved to Colorado and was like in the foothills of the mountains, and I'd wake up in the morning and feel like I was Snow White, and that there were like birds who were going to come and fly on my shoulder, and little bunnies and gopher and deer. I didn't really understand why we had to care. And it's like when I see you and this background, and for our listeners, you don't know, but about 5 minutes ago, Saul was actually following a 6-foot lizard around trying to show us. Perhaps it's there. Oh, I see it now. It's moving. But it's the topic is very personal to me because I feel like I had the curtain lifted at a certain point, right? And I definitely care more now. But when I was younger, I had no understanding. And I always just was like, what's up with these tree huggers, right? Like, I didn't even understand why people had to care.
I think this is a hugely interesting topic. There was actually a lot of hand wringing in the early environmentalist movement about how can we raise a generation who will love the environment. And actually, my favorite of Rachel Carson's books is not Silent Spring, but actually a book she wrote for her nephew about exploring tide pools and how to discover and get a lifelong love for nature just in the tide pools. I think it was of Maine. But, I think these programs that try to get inner city kids out into the national parks and then the very idea of national parks are hugely important, because I think it is a stretch and an abstract to say we should save the world for the tree's sake, if you've never seen a tree or developed a love for the lizards.
Mm-hmm. Well, we don't really have any 6-foot lizards in our backyard. There he is. Oh my God, that thing is huge. For people need to go to YouTube if you're listening. That it looks like, I don't know, a very, very big squirrel.
What's the name of it?
It's called a goanna or a monitor lizard. It's about it's about 8 foot from my big toe, and it's about 6 foot long.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
It looks a little bit like an alligator.
Okay, that or a mini.
It does look like an alligator. The reason,
more like an alligator than a squirrel.
Yeah, clearly.
The reason
well,
it's
I
here,
spent a lot of time in nature. Clearly, not so good on naming of the creatures.
I think in the same way that we've hidden nature from ourselves, right? And not a lot of kids grow up seeing lizards. You don't realize that you burn, 200 pounds of fossil fuels every American every day. Right?
Wow.
Because we've hidden it. We've hidden all those coal trains. We've hidden all those natural gas pipelines. You don't really think about it when you stick that thing in your car and magically you then drive away from the gas station. You just poured an amount of gasoline that's as big as you, and then you burn that every week, and then you go and get another one. But like, we've hidden, not only hidden nature from ourselves, we've hidden some of our problems and assaults on nature from ourselves. But
the truth is that it's will catch up to us, and like so many of us, like not my parents but my grandparents I'm half white, half Mexican, on my white side were coal miners, so much of our history as a people, especially in the United States, getting to the power that it had was because of coal, was because of oil, and now we're in this moment where like it's caught up with us. And the Biden administration I feel so much relief. I think when Trump won in 2016, I was scared for my family, and I was incredibly frightened of the consequences of climate change and an administration that had no intention of tackling the issue or even admitting that the issue was real. And now we've just this week rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, and it feels like we're moving in the right direction. But what I love and excited to talk to you about is that you give me a lot of hope that we can solve this. But before we get there, I want to ask you to just really frankly talk about all of that, the hidden consequences that are catching up with us. Like, what are we really up against to be able to tackle climate change, and how much time do we really have? Like, how fast does this administration need to move, and at what scale, to actually make sure that we don't suffer the most dire consequences of what climate change could do to us as a species and for our planet?
So you've just invited a monologue. I'll try to keep it short. But let's provide some context. So yes, we announced this week that we've rejoined the Paris Agreement. I'm not enormously excited about that. I was hoping that we would announce that not only were we going to rejoin, but we were going to lead the Paris Agreement in being more binding and more ambitious. Maybe that is to come, and that is the political pressure we need to keep on the Biden team. Victory was just the beginning. So what do I mean by that? The climate negotiation process has been long, right? So this year will be COP26, the 26th one of these things. So it's been a long time coming. A few things to mention. So we used to have a 2-degree target as accepted, but that was 2 degrees Celsius. For American audience, we should understand that as closer to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And really, we chose 2 degrees in 2050 as round numbers. People think in round numbers. We've since realized that we probably should be shooting for 1.5 degrees. If you want to keep any coral reefs in the world and keep agriculture stable, 1.5 degrees is a much safer target than 2 degrees. You've already seen at only 1 degree terrifying bushfires in Australia. Apparently my life is about choosing the places to live with the worst fires. But my 2 homes, California, Australia, both burned to the ground multiple times in the last few years, and that's at 1 degree. So 1.5 degrees would be a better target. The Paris Agreement was not binding, and actually the commitments that all of the nations of the world have made amount not to hitting 2 degrees, but 3 degrees. So we haven't committed enough, and we're not even meeting those commitments. Even screwier, in the early 2000s, we allowed a couple of loopholes in the way we did the accounting for what a commitment could be. In fact, America and Australia are bad offenders in getting credit for not touching forests. So they get a carbon credit for leaving something alone. So that was a little bit of a cheat. The other cheats included allowing us to believe that there will be negative emissions in the future. And you've heard about these carbon capturing. And so most countries in the world, in committing to Paris, are committing with a technology that we don't know will work and probably can't be done at large enough scale to suck down negative emissions in the future. You should probably discount all of those negative emissions as not going to happen or not going to happen enough. So that brings the urgency forward even more, because we baked those in because of lobbyist groups, but we shouldn't have baked them into the global response. The final sort of twist is there's a concept that's now becoming more broadly known called committed emissions. One of you might have bought a fossil fuel, a gasoline-powered car 2 years ago and a natural gas hot water heater last year. That car will exist for 20 years. That hot water heater will burn natural gas for 14 years if they are average. People are still building coal plants that will exist for 40 years. People are still building natural gas peaker plants that will exist for 50 years. So those machines have committed emissions associated with them. Because they're just going to live out their life, they're going to commit those emissions. So here's the very stark reality of where we are in climate. If we let all of the machines on Earth that exist today that burn fossil fuels live out their natural life burning fossil fuels, they will emit enough carbon dioxide to take us somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. what is the flip side of that statement? That means without negative emissions, which you shouldn't bet on, we need to make sure at the retirement of every car, the retirement of every furnace, the retirement of every hot water heater, the retirement of every gas burning stove and range, replace them with a zero carbon electrical option, which is powered by renewables or potentially clean nuclear energy. And so the urgency is incredible, right? In fact, we can't produce enough electric cars, as evidenced by waiting lists if you sign up for most of them, to meet that demand. I think we're producing about 1 million electric cars in the world a year. Americans buy 16 million vehicles a year. So we need a massive increase in the production rate. So it's great news that GM and Volkswagen and everyone is finally coming to the electric car party, but they're still coming too late. We similarly, we're an order of magnitude is the fancy way of saying it, but our production rates of solar are 10 times too slow. Our production rates of wind energy are 10 times too slow. So really, if you were trying to do your best possible job, we need Kamala and Joe to wake up tomorrow morning and fully absorb that they need to be FDR and declare war on climate change. And that's a very specific analogy that I use for the following reason. In 1939, Hitler had invaded France. Churchill called Roosevelt and said, "I'm scared, I'm worried. If Hitler takes England, he'll take our Navy and then he'll come after you." This motivated FDR to create something called the Wartime Production Award, because Churchill said, this is a war that's going to be fought in the air, it's going to be fought by tanks. It's not like World War I that was fought with people, it's going to be fought with machines. So the winner will be whoever can produce the most machines most quickly. And that Wartime Production Board took American production of airplanes from a few hundred in 1939 to 100,000 per year by 1943. And it was that enormous industrial effort that won the war. So step one in America stepping up on climate change is ramping up our production of all of these critical industries. And back then it was boats, bullets, tanks, airplanes. Today it's batteries, solar cells, windmills, and transmission lines, and electric vehicles. But we need to ramp them up all as fast as possible so that, hopefully by 2025, 2030 at the latest, anytime anyone buys a car, they can buy an electric car, and it will be the cheapest, best option. Anytime anyone needs to buy a water heater or a furnace for their house, the electric heat pump is the cheapest option. So we need a massive ramp up, and then we need 100% adoption rates. And, that is hard. It is possible, but that's the only way we're really going to keep ourselves under 2 degrees.
Saul, our country has, you could arguably say, been at war for a very long time. And I find this comparison to mobilizing for a war very interesting, perhaps even ironic, because people view, there's like a different connotation for this. Talk to me about this, I know you explained sort of the similarities of what happened in 1939, but what it means right now, and for us to sort of turn this corner to mobilize in a warlike effort, right, in our conscious, because I think that's the sort of effort we're going to need to make, and the commitment we're going to need to make in order to change this.
Yeah, and I'm getting nervous when I use the war analogy. I think it would be, I prefer to state it in a more positivist, less violent manner. So that analogy is to say that we can ramp up production in industry. And we did it for the threat of the specter of the axis of evil. It's unclear that the threat of climate change is enough yet to motivate. But remember that FDR did another big motivational thing in response to the Great Depression, which is very analogous to what we just went through with COVID and the consequent unemployment and economic downturn. And there were huge public works programs that built a lot of, America's infrastructure. A lot of it was built as a response to that Great Depression. Other amazing things happened. 20% of people were unemployed in America as a result of the Great Depression. 25% of those were unemployed from the construction industry. The construction industry couldn't build because nobody could borrow any money. up until 1930, American mortgages were basically 5-year loans with a balloon payment at the end. The reason so many people lost their homes at the end of the 1930s was that the balloon payment came due. They'd lost their job. They couldn't make the payment. They lost their home. So in 1936, FDR and his crew created something called the Federal Housing Authority, and then they created Fannie Mae. And literally the worst economic depression in the world gave fruit and bore the modern 30-year mortgage, the American home loan that we now all know and love. And it brought into existence the largest pool of capital that has ever existed on the planet. So maybe instead of saying, you know, if we were using a positivist frame instead of a wartime framing, a giant investment in the American suburbs as infrastructure, and let's qualify all of our solar cells for that infrastructure quality financing. All of our electric vehicles should be declared national infrastructure, because quite frankly, I'm going to need the battery from Christina's car to occasionally top up my home in the middle of the night, and your electric heat pump will occasionally need to draw electricity that's being generated in my community. So all of these things become part of the national infrastructure. And so we could have this huge rebuilding of the crumbling American infrastructure. In fact, the only project large enough to put back to work the 10 million Americans still out of work from COVID is fixing this infrastructure and fixing climate change. Mm-hmm. And by necessity, they have to be domestic jobs, right? I can't install solar on your roof from China. I can't go into your basement and exchange your furnace for an electric heat pump from Mexico, right? These are domestic jobs. And if America chooses to, they can be manufacturing all these things as well and have huge growth in not only manufacturing, but in construction. So these are jobs in every community. You know, I've spent my whole life practicing for this football match.
Right. And, you know, I think one of the things that I've really appreciated about listening to you and your work at Rewiring America is, especially here in Texas, where we are so embedded in the oil and gas industry. You know, we live at this strange place in Texas where we are the largest carbon emitter of any state in the country. And at the same time, no state could produce more wind or solar energy than Texas. And, you know, one of the things that a lot of our legislators like to do is they like to paint the climate crisis as completely insurmountable, that it's too expensive, too expansive, and thus let's just keep going the way we're going. And your work at Rewiring America talks about how to electrify everything, that, you know, there is a rapid transition that we can have and our lives actually could be better. So can you, you know, for the average person, especially here in Texas, we are really taught, again, to believe it's too insurmountable, it's too expensive, it's too expansive. We cannot solve this crisis, but you believe we can. How do we do that? What does that look like, for example, for our energy we get in our homes, the cars we drive? You know, just paint a picture of that for us.
Well, you've already mentioned it. Texas has spectacular solar and wind resources, and in fact has brought on more renewables than I think any state in the country in the last few years, and is doing an incredible job. So Texas can be a producer, and you know, I work with solar companies and I work with wind energy companies that are selling solar and wind that's generating electricity at 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour in Texas. That is phenomenally cheap. The average cost of electricity at your household in the US is about 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So the reality in California, which now has good, you know, the best electric infrastructure in the US, or in Norway for electric vehicles, has very good infrastructure now. We're now seeing that the cost of driving an electric vehicle is about 3 cents a mile in terms of energy, whereas if you're burning $2 or $3 a gallon gas in your car, it's closer to 15 to 20 cents per mile. It would be even cheaper than that 2 or 3 cents if you could be using Australian rooftop solar to drive your car. Similarly, if you were using that rooftop solar to run your air conditioner, you would be making a giant saving over the current price of electricity in Texas delivered to you. Similarly, if you converted the heat in your homes that you need through the winter from natural gas to electricity using a heat pump, that cheap electricity on your roof and cheap electricity from Texas wind and solar will make the cost of heating your home lower. The average average Texan household will save about $2,500 a year on all of its energy bills. To contextualize that, the average American household has about $61,000 a year to spend after taxes. And today they spend about $4,500 a year. They spend close to $2,000 on gasoline, which is more than they spend on all fresh food and vegetables in that household. Wow. They spend close to $1,500 on electricity, which is more than they spend on education in that household. And they spend more than $400 a year on heating fuels like natural gas, which is more than they spend on dentistry in that household. So you have to imagine just on the raw numbers that $2,500 that we could realize as savings to every home in the US would be incredible. If you added that up across every home in the US, we'd be saving $350 billion a year. So it makes you wonder, what was the failure in communication of the Green New Deal that told us that this was going to cost $20 trillion, right? Everyone wants to mention the top line. Oh, 20 trillion, that's impossible. Well, yes, it will cost $20 trillion, but you're going to spend that $20 trillion over 20 years because you're not going to replace the car you bought last year for another 10 or 15 years. You're not going to replace the hot water heater you bought 5 years ago for another decade. So we're going to do it slowly. And it's not a cost, it's an investment. And because the cost of this solar and this wind is going to be so cheap, it's going to be realized as a saving in every household. Wow. So we have that huge economic thing to win. It's going to be, quite frankly, wealthier households, those energy savings don't matter. But the lower income households, it's going to be hugely important. This, just to bookmark a thought for later in the conversation, is like, I think this is where the front line of the climate justice equity conversation is. It's really about how are we going to make sure that the bottom 50% of households by income can afford these capital items. If we don't, you can't solve climate change if only 50% of people can afford it, right? We got to bring the whole country along. And so we need loans. We need to, 40% of hot water heaters and air conditioners are bought under duress today. The approximate story is your wife is pregnant or your lover is sick and it's the middle of winter or the middle of summer and you need an air conditioner or a hot water heater and you're told to go buy one. But, some huge portion, I think it's 40 or 50% of American homes only have $800 of cash in reserves, right? So they have to go out and buy this thing, and they got 24 hours to have a solution because you don't want to have your pregnant wife not have air conditioning in the middle of the Texan summer, or your sick lover not have heat in the middle of the New Hampshire winter. So you buy the cheapest natural gas burning thing or the least efficient air conditioner. So, and I think should be a huge emphasis of the Biden administration is how do we provide low-cost financing at the point of purchase for everyone so everyone can participate in this future and everyone can be saving money when we get there.
Women of color are leaders in driving political progress. From Wonder Media Network, the Brown Girls Guide to Politics is the one-stop shop for women of color who want to hear and talk about the world of politics. Each week, host Ashanti Goler speaks with women of color who are organizers, activists, politicians, and more, who are all pushing for progress. This season, Ashanti is dissecting the Biden-Harris administration's first 100 days, its plans to confront a pandemic, an economic crisis, racial justice, and climate change. Tune in to hear from experts on how the new administration's plan will impact BIPOC communities. Listen and subscribe to the Brown Girls Guide to Politics, wherever you get your podcasts.
So let's talk about Texas. Most of the fossil fuel generating states say that it's going to cost too much and they have fear of losing revenue. In 2016, the morning after Trump won, being the person I did, I think all my friends were either crying or celebrating, depending on which flavor they were, but they were all doing what they were doing. I was looking at energy data and fossil fuel production statistics as it voted in that election. And in 2016, 87% of red states voted, 87% of fossil fuels were produced in states that voted 87% of natural gas, 88% of coal, and 86% of oil were produced in red states. right? So you can see why the red states think they have a lot to lose in solving climate change.
Mhm.
And they did that analysis again in 2020, this year, and the numbers really haven't changed. But what's interesting this year is in 2016, it was about equal, the production of renewable energy in red states versus the production of renewable energy in blue states. In 2020, the red states are absolutely crushing it at beating the blue states in producing wind and solar. Now, why is this? It's actually far more obvious than you think. The red states are rural, they own all the land. If you own all the land, you own all the fossil fuels. If you own all the land, you own all the space to put the solar cells. And if you own all the land, you own all the space to put the wind turbines. So it is quite easy. And if you just do the land area analysis, by the way, red and blue votes, the red states own 70-something% of the land. So who's going to win when we do this giant deployment of renewables and we put wind turbines on every farm and we put solar alongside every highway and in these rural areas? It's going to be the red states. So Texas, there's a lot of cynical politicians who are still having you play the fear of what they're going to lose, but there is an enormous opportunity for Texas to win, and it's already winning the most in the race to deploy wind and solar.
It seems like a failure to a certain extent of storytelling on our part about the financial opportunity. But I also know there are a lot of jobs attached to the fossil fuel industry, and how do we explore what those job transitions look like, so that it doesn't feel like you are going to steal the rug right out from under me and I'm not going to be able to feed my family because we're going to move to solar and wind.
Yeah, so I think you said it perfectly in your first sentence. It's a failure of storytelling.
Yeah.
And if you think about, there's a few failures in storytelling from the environmentalist climate change solving left. One is they're still fighting the 1970s energy problem, and they're selling you that efficiency is the answer. Smaller cars, smaller homes, colder homes, which was true for the oil crisis in 1970, right? 15% of our energy supply was cut off. So in theory, you could solve that crisis by 15% smaller, more efficient cars, 15% more efficient appliances. That gave us Energy Star appliances and cafe fuel standards. But people don't really want smaller cars, people don't really want smaller homes, and you can't shrink those things and be more efficient all the way down to zero carbon. So you just got to transform. But a lot of environmentalism is still telling you okay, we're only going to fix this with public transport and cold, small homes with bicycles out front.
Yeah.
So we've got that 50 years of that narrative fear going on. And then because of this committed emissions problem, scientists identified the correct answer that the fastest way to reduce emissions is to find the worst offending power plants that are the biggest, namely coal, and pull them off the grid before they've even reached the end of their lifetime. This is called early retirement. And that's why the thing became about closing down coal plants, and that sounded like those jobs go away overnight. Yeah. Tomorrow. It's like, we're all going to be unemployed tomorrow. And it was a panic story, and it was exploited. And I think it's much more realistic to just acknowledge that most of the machines that exist are going to live out their normal lifetime. And the normal lifetime for most of these machines is 10, 20, or 30 years. And if you think about 10 or 20 or 30 years, that is quite literally a working generation.
Sure.
So I think we do need to absolutely retrain a few people who are in the wrong geographic location when something shuts down. But there's a huge number of analogous jobs in the refitting the HVAC sector, heating, cooling, to what the skill set that overlays with the natural gas industry. There's the infrastructure, laying the infrastructure for transmission lines looks a lot like the same types of jobs that you do with cranes and forklifts and trucks when you're laying pipelines. So there's a huge retraining opportunity, but I also think, it's going to happen over the generation. We just have to stop training people to work in the coal industry and start training them to install air conditioning systems, and stop training people to work in the natural gas pipeline industry and start training them to work in the rooftop solar and community solar installation industry.
We need to appropriately frame the timeline, right?
like
frame the timeline. It's a generation.
The switch. Yeah, it's a generation's worth of work. So I have one more question, and that is, I think a lot of our listeners will be hearing this and wondering what can we do inside of our own homes that will make the most meaningful impact. So, I mean, just very quickly, is that like when I sell this car that I'm in that does burn gas, do I buy an electric vehicle? Do I reduce my meat consumption?
I have spent a lot of this phone call trying to figure out if it's a Prius you're sitting in.
It's not. It's not. There's my dirty confession. But what are the things that we can do to start to impact this in our own homes? And maybe it's taking our kids into nature and helping them build a relationship with nature so that they're invested in the protection of it.
I would love everyone's first step is to take their kids and a couple of low-income kids in the same community out into America's spectacular national parks and see a few eagles and contextualize what there is to win. And I think that is a wonderful first step that I'm all in on. But when you get back from that camping trip, I think we've had a lot of success with Rewiring America in reducing climate change to something you can understand around your kitchen table, right? Because the historic conversation is about the Keystone Pipeline and shutting down coal. But this is, again, I think a narrative mistake of the environmentalist movement. Says it's the oil company's fault, right? But actually it's the Toyota, 2% of the world's energy is burned in engines that Toyota makes and sells. And who buys those? We do, right? We're all a little bit complicit. I think this is a good reason for why we should forgive fossil fuels. They've made our lives really good for a long time. So let's forgive them a little. But recognize our role in it, and decisions you make in your home and our collective homes are about 40 to 45% of our emissions. So that's the fuel in the cars we drive, the fossil fuels used to make the cars we drive, the oil or natural gas you burn in your furnace, stove, hot water heater. And you start to think about it, the list is actually shockingly small, and they're things you buy every 10 years. So it's your clothes dryer. Does it run on natural gas, or is it going to be a heat clothes dryer? It's your stove. Does it run on natural gas? Incidentally, you're righteous mamas. You probably care about your children's respiratory health. If you go to an American doctor and you present with a child that has respiratory problems, the first question that doctor will ask is, do you burn natural gas in your kitchen? Is your house run on natural gas? So we have allowed carbon monoxide and all the NOxes and the SOxes to pollute our indoor air quality by virtue of this clean blue flame that we've been sold for 30 years. Let's just emphasize that there's something more to win. But to step back to your question, sweat less about what cereal you buy tomorrow and whether it comes in recycled packaging and is organic, because you can tire yourself out trying to make every single purchase of a tin of tuna the right one. And start thinking about the infrastructure of your life, exactly what you're saying. So let me start preparing and saving now so that when this car dies, I'll get an electric one. Let me start preparing and saving now so that when my air conditioner blows and my furnace blows, I'll do a radiant floor system that will improve the air quality in my house and lower my energy bills. And I think that is a very useful way for people to start thinking about it, because the reality is, for most righteous mamas today, unless you're in the top 5 or 10% of house incomes and households, it's still a little bit expensive, right? Get in the mindset of thinking about these 5 or 6 things in your life. They're either in your garage or in your basement or in your kitchen, and prepare to make them electric and prepare to power them with solar panels on your roof the next time you can afford to do so and the next time they need replacing. Let the wealthier righteous mamas help get the cost down over the next 2 or 3 years. Advocate enormously. So you're what we really need to build, in my mind. Polling suggests there's 70 million Americans who are ready for rapid action on climate change. but they've never had a home, and no one except for Al Gore ever told them what to do. And what was the answer at the end of his movie? It was a fairly unsatisfying: buy a stainless steel water bottle and change your light bulbs. But what we actually need is for
and I did that.
And you did that,
So
and that was great. I thank you all. I thank you all a lot. Now for your second act, the request is you need to become the kinds we need to collectively, those 70 million mums and dads and family leaders and their partners and lovers need to become the largest climate movement ever.
Perfect.
Perfect.
On that note, Saul, I actually wanted to ask you, I actually have my daughter here. Come sit down. This is Misha. She's in 7th grade right now. And as you were talking earlier, I had a flashback to when she was literally 8 months old and our AC went out in the middle of the summer in Austin. And I remember I called and we just got it repaired right away because we had to. And so I like the ethos of thinking differently about how we want to invest in our future and be saving and prepared for making the changes we need to make, because it is an investment. And on that note, in building that sort of large movement, she actually had 2 questions that she wanted to ask you. And so trying to set up the future generation to be thinking about this, Misha, I'll let you ask your 2 questions. And she's been listening the whole time, by the way.
I wish I could bring in my 7th grader to answer your questions to see whether or not he has been learning.
So I heard you talking about making clean things affordable in the US, but how can we make clean energy, clean machines, and electric cars more accessible to everybody in the whole world?
So that is a great question. There's been a lot of talk and fear of China in the last few political cycles, but China actually is doing an incredible job of lowering the cost of electric vehicles, and a huge amount of the global supply chain for solar energy is through China. And yes, they didn't play nice and they didn't play fair and they did subsidize the solar industry, but it has resulted in them making a lot. So your question is so mature, it requires a very long-winded response. And maybe the best answer is, we need America to be a little bit scared that it's going to lose. And we need America want to win, which it historically has been able to do in creating these industries for the future. And that requires, politics of climate in America is framed as what we have to lose. We're going to lose our cars. We're going to lose our oil and gas industry in Texas. But it needs to be framed in terms of what we have to win. And what we have to win is an enormous wind industry. There's been, just to give you an example, there's been a really interesting thing happening in Australia. Australia now says we're going to be 700% renewable. And you might say, I can kind of understand what 100% renewable means. That means we're going to supply all of our energy with renewable energy. But Australia, like America, exports energy because it can produce more than it needs. And Australia exports a huge amount of coal. So to compensate for losing that coal export industry, Australia is now thinking about how do we take renewable wind, how do we take renewable solar and make a giant export industry. So I think as an idea to get Americans behind what there is to win, we no longer need to say, let's struggle to get to 90% or 100%. How about, yay America, 200% renewable. America has phenomenal solar and wind resources, and it sounds like a much more American goal, right? It's like, okay, we are going to not just do nearly enough, we are going to crush it and we are going to develop a lot. And I think it needs to be that attitude and that, like, what there is to win, and turning over that, like, changing that narrative is the most important thing to do.
I think winning, hopefully, is a language we understand around here. And she's got.
You're ready for some winning after the last 4 years of winning.
I'm going with it. And so, I sit there and I think about what you said. And I think between the 3 of us, Christina, Martha, and myself, all of our kids and families in the last couple of years, our kids have grown up being civically engaged and active and trying to drive for change. So I have a lot of hope that future generations are going to show up and be vocal. And on that note, and again, forward progress, my daughter's got a second question for you.
I know that you are a scientist, an inventor, and that you started a business. And as you know, I'm in 7th grade. What advice do you have for me to learn how to tinker and invent to keep or to solve climate change?
I think there's 2 very critical things you need to do. We've undermined, and this might be a little bit unexpected, we have undermined the teaching of arts and creativity in basically throughout the world. There's been such an overemphasis on STEM that we have forgotten to learn to paint, learn to draw, learn to play music, and learn to fully exercise the creativity of that side of the brain. And
I want to like scream and shout from the rooftops in agreement with you. Yes.
Well, I have to because my mother, who's a painter and artist, is in the background. If I don't say that, she would scream from the rooftops, but in a less polite way. But no, I really genuinely mean it. Like, these are the disciplines that you have to learn if you want to think broadly and creatively. And that's where the invention side comes along. And then STEM, I think, has overemphasized, it didn't mean to, but it has gone down the path of rote learning and just do more programming and more code until you get there. But I think what it needs to come back to is just a fundamental rigor. Just learn the small number of fundamental physical principles, fundamental chemical principles, and fundamental mathematical principles, and then have those with such ease and grace and such competence that you can let the creative side of your mind manipulate them into beautiful solutions. And that's, so I want you to gain rigor, but absolutely do some bodybuilding and muscle building in creativity and the arts.
So,
thank you for that response.
Thank you, Misha, for joining
us. I made myself cry a little bit because I think we really need that. Thank you. It's a great question, Misha.
Misha, thank you for joining us. And Saul, thank you so much for joining us. We want to remind people to go to rewiringamerica.org so they can download your handbook about how we build that climate movement to remake our global economy and country. But I also just want to say, you know, I've spent the last 2 years, sorry, just re-record that.
Start over.
That just like I personally spent the last 2 years working and trying to understand that here in Texas, in so many ways, we are the epicenter of both this crisis and massive opportunity, and that your work has been some of the most brilliant and critical work in understanding how to reframe this issue. Again, not just for the crisis it is, but the opportunity to talk about, you know, how we address the fact that we could make millions of more jobs and we could make more equitable jobs, about how our air could be cleaner, about how lower income folks wouldn't have to spend so much of their hard-earned cash on gas for their cars or paying for their electricity bills, that our lives as consumers and families and workers could actually be better. And just so thank you for helping me and all of our listeners and thousands of people across this country and across the globe reframe this issue so we can win.
I really thank you all, and you've reminded me of something that I don't think about often enough. We all need to give ourselves some slack and admit that none of us know how to do this yet, right? We don't know the exact way, but I think what I do know and what we all know is, like, even with transformation in American politics that hopefully just happened, that politics won't move far enough unless there is a giant democratic voting army below it that is making the demands and building the movement. So I don't know exactly how to build the AARP of climate yet, and we certainly need a better acronym. You know, the Righteous Mamas of Climate would certainly be a better step in the right direction. So, like, you know, stay tuned. Let's build that army together, and that, you know, if enough of the American people demand that we get to this end goal of this more vibrant, more abundant future, That's the only way we're going to get there. The politicians react to us.
That's right.
So we need to make the demand. So
Yeah.
I think you all work in it's going to be movement builders like you guys, not nerds like me who make this work out.
Oh, we need righteous mamas, righteous papas, some nerds, and also some courageous young people like Misha. And I just wanted to remind all the moms and folks listening that have younger people in their lives that really who's been pushing so much of our country and holding politicians accountable has been young people around Misha's age. I have a younger sister that's 12 actually also, and I just called her last week because she's been bored at home. And I said, have you heard of this thing called the Sunrise Movement, where you can be making phone calls and like a difference over Zoom and feel connected and about this issue you care about? So I just want to remind parents that there's also ways for our kids to connect, to fight back and use their own power and voice, even if they can't vote right now.
It'll be the TikToking kids who build that movement for us.
It will. And they'll name it better than the AARP for sure.
Absolutely.
My kid is laughing at me because she doesn't have TikTok.
Because I have great parents.
But yes, the kids and TikTok will save us. Thank you so much for joining us, Saul, and showing us your lizard and sharing your wisdom with us. And we continue to be in the struggle. And again, just shout out to y'all. I know Christina mentioned Rewiring America and going and being able to click and get the book, but make that donation and join the world's largest movement for changing the climate. Thank you for being with us, Saul.
Thank you, Saul. So for me, what really stuck, well, actually a couple of things. Getting kids in nature is like that's something that really resonates for me, and making sure that as many kids have the opportunity to fall in love with the opportunities in nature. I love that just because like I could devote my life to that. But the other thing that I really liked about the way Saul framed the climate crisis is taking the generational lens with it and really focusing on the systems, not only that within our government, but within our homes. And, thinking about, okay, so making plans to make my next car purchase be electric, and to take a beat when our water heater goes out, because it's going to go out any minute, and make sure that we are able to appropriately invest in the infrastructure to make some of those structural changes. I think that that's really helpful, and that it feels really threatening when you're talking to somebody about shutting down the way of life that they have lived for so long. That's got to feel very scary. But framed correctly, I think that, like he says, we have an opportunity. This is the biggest opportunity of our lives. What do you think, Muna?
I was kind of floored by the wartime comparison. I know that that's a little bit of the language that's been used to talk about climate change and how we mobilize as a country to change things. I think I took a couple of things away. You can't mobilize in a direction if we don't have agreement. So public sentiment matters. And we have to shift public sentiment. But what does that mean? It means we have to change a little bit of how we're educated about the issue. That is for adults and for kids, though I think the kids get it a little bit more than the adults, but who knows, maybe I'm generalizing there. Another thing that comes up is who gets to define what is truth or what are the facts, and how the conversation is framed, which is a bigger conversation, but it's one that we have to solve for, because we can only make decisions based on the information we have. And it seems to be there's at least 2, if not 3 or 4 different sets of information floating around there, which then impact how we frame the conversation, right? Like that example Saul gave about, well, it's, this many $1 trillion will be in debt, except you're going to be spending this much anyways. And so like, how do you frame up the conversation? How do you frame up the losses or the gains or the way our community's impacted? And I think for Misha's question, and Misha, you tell me what you thought, but while science and technology matters, art matters fundamentally, because we have to be able to think with both sides of our brain in order to solve problems, and come up with creative solutions. And I don't know, what do you think, considering you're in school and you see the emphasis on STEM, and granted mommy's in tech, but how does the conversation seem based on what we were talking about versus what you might be hearing from your friends or the influencers that you listen to on YouTube?
Well, I think it's definitely important that kids and the younger generation is exposed to all different things, just not just STEM, but like my mom said, art and things that can help their creative ability grow, because then they're able to think outside of the box, not just in STEM, if that makes sense.
Totally.
And
I think that's a great way to say it.
And so much of this is thinking outside of the box. It's thinking into the present need, but the future possibilities, right? What I love about Saul's work is that it's about problem solving and seeing crisis as actually the opportunity to address a whole scale of other issues that are connected, right? The fact that we're talking about, what do we do if, what can we do as individuals? But we're also living in a time where right now the new number is 69% of Americans don't have more than $1,000 in savings. So the idea that they can go buy, a lot of people cannot afford to buy their personal way out of this. We've got to do it as a country. So I thought we could end. I wanted to read actually just a paragraph of the beginning of his book, because I think it's just frames it really well for us. So this is from Saul Griffith's book. We look for solutions, not barriers. We outline pathways to success. We don't begin with the question of what is politically possible, but ask what is technically necessary to make a climate solution that is also the best economic pathway for a country. We need mobilization of technology, industry, labor, regulatory reform, and critically, finance. The industrial mobilization required will mean an effort similar to World War II's arsenal of democracy in size, speed, and scope. For a world looking to bounce back from a pandemic and economic crisis, there is no other project that would create this many jobs. An analysis shows that there are tens of millions of good-paying jobs that will be created in every zip code, suburb, and rural town in America. It is by no means easy, but it is still possible, but not for long. Billionaires may dream of escaping to Mars, but for the rest of us, we have to stay here and fight.
Yeah, and we got to. And the mama's got to be part of it, because we only have this one world right now, and we got to build it for all our kids.